What's up, my friends? I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and here's something that I think is absolutely true. Ready? Words change. What words mean and how they get employed changes. And I think there are three ways that we see words evolve, change, and maybe even become less effective over time. Way number one is when a word goes from meaning a thing to meaning everything. For example, the word thing. It's just so dang general that while it is accurate to call this microphone a thing or this table a thing, is really not that helpful. When something means everything, it effectively means nothing. Another way for a word to evolve or even lose its effectiveness is for a word to become so irrelevant and so descriptive of only things that are remembered in the distant past that it just isn't that helpful anymore. For example, have you ever heard the word numbles? I just came across this one the other day. What a great word, numbles. Do you know what it means? You got a second right now to impress somebody watching this with you. Okay, but only a second. Time's up. Numbles refers to deer entrails that you could bake into a pie if you were real poor. This is a way you could get nutrition back in a simpler time, back in yesteryear. Well, nobody says numbles anymore. Well, hardly anybody says numbles anymore. And the only place where this word really comes up is in a vestigial form when we say that person had to eat humble pie. That's derived from numbles pie or numble pie. Well, the reason the word isn't that effective anymore is because circumstances changed. How we think about food changed. What people do if they're on kind of tough times to get by in a pinch changed. They don't go out and ask if they can please have the undesirable gut pile from a hunter who is going to take the good meat with him so they can go home and feed their family a disgusting gut pie. They have other solutions for trying to scrounge up a bite to eat. So words can change because they become so general that they mean everything. Words can change because they become so specific and locked in a moment in time that they become less and less relevant as time goes on. And then a third way that words can change is simply by flipping meanings. I mean, almost altogether flipping meanings. I literally mean that. Wait, did I literally mean that or did I figuratively mean that? Because literally now means figuratively and literally. It literally means both. But it didn't a couple of decades ago. So the point of language, of course, is clarity. It's to satisfy one of the most basic human impulses, human needs that you feel and that I feel. This is something that binds us together as people who have something in common. It's a need that we meet for each other, and that is to know and be known, to understand other people. And there are language purists out there who hate this phenomenon that I'm describing. And they're like, well, I don't want words to change and I'll go to battle for those. But there aren't that many because most people would just rather be understood and understand than battle for the soul of words that don't mean that much. But I think all of us have a word here or there that we're not so willing to see change, to evolve because it means something to us, because it means something to our identity and who we are and where we fit and how we make sense of the world around us and ourselves and life and death and aging and God. And one such word that I think is currently going through this evolutionary process and that people hold very near and dear is evangelical. In the last couple of videos, we've been talking about this term. I sat down with Dr. Mark Knoll 2 videos ago. He's this rock star, mega genius, historian, expert on the history of evangelicalism, the history of American and Western Christianity. And we processed it out, and we got to the end of him explaining where this Christian movement called evangelicalism had been and where it's going next. And I sensed a degree of skepticism in him about the effectiveness of the word in general. And so at the end, I more or less asked him, like, what's the future of the word? Does this word still make sense? And he hesitated reflectively. And then he said, paraphrase his mind here, roughly, he said, I think the word is being asked to do too much. I think evangelical maybe needs a rest as a term. I've thought about that for a long time. That conversation has stuck with me. I've read books since then. I've wrestled with it since then. And I've come to the conclusion that I think Dr. Knoll has a point. I think The word evangelicalism, which historically, by the way, was described in decades past based on four factors, four characteristics of a certain type of Christian, that if you had these four characteristics, I guess you're an evangelical. One, that the cross is important, that Jesus' sacrifice there resolves sin and death. Two, that the Bible is authoritative, it's from God, it's accurate. Three, that conversion is a thing that happens either by process or in an instant, where a person goes from dead in their sins to alive in Christ. And four, that you got to give that stuff away, that going out and doing redemptive things and telling other people about Jesus is important. Those four things, that's been the agreed upon definition now for several decades in terms of what an evangelical is. And when that definition was put in place, it was a great descriptor, a great way to lump and organize and name this big center-cut swath of Christianity in the Western world. But time passes, words evolve, things change, and Dr. Knoll, who is better positioned than maybe anybody to observe that process of history, looks at it and says, I think that evolution has maybe been sufficient that a different term might be needed. So evangelical, on the one hand, much like the word things, is so broad that it means everything, and therefore it means almost nothing. It's kind of like Dash from The Incredibles when he said, when everybody's special, nobody is. When a word means everything, it means nothing. And so evangelical means Joel Osteen's church. It means some expressions of Mormonism. It means some expressions of Catholicism. That could include your bedazzled jeans, slickly produced non-denominational megachurch thing. That could include elements of your Reformed crowd. That definition of evangelical could include your 1619 King James only fundamentalist independent Baptist crowd. Pentecostals would certainly fit under the umbrella of evangelical as well. If you've been hanging out with me and you've been learning more, as I've been learning more about how all of these different churches work and where they all fit and what they believe, you know, dang, that's an umbrella that's so big it almost doesn't even make sense. At that point, the term Christian would probably be better than evangelical, given how disparate everything on that list that I just threw out is. So I agree with Dr. Knoll because I think the word evangelical is increasingly too broad to have any effectiveness at all. And if it doesn't provide any specificity, there's not much use for the word. But additionally, I think the word is in trouble because it also represents a bygone age. Not that those theological principles are bygone or done or antiquated, but the term speaks to a moment in history where that term was needed and where that term was satisfactory. But much like numbles only exists in the modern mind in the derivative form of the saying, that person had to eat some humble pie, so evangelical is a vestigial word. It has lingering remnants of some of the things that it used to mean, but mostly what it specifically described has moved on or morphed into something else. So there's two reasons I think the term evangelical has become less effective. And the third is that I think evangelical has almost flipped in the mind of most people to a completely different meaning. The impulse that made David Bevington want to sit down, George Marsden want to sit down and try to figure out how to characterize evangelicals was that, well, it was a theological group that was theologically distinctive. Since then, that group has become politically distinctive. And so a whole lot of people use the term evangelical as a generic lumping of a voting bloc that tends to vote along certain lines. And as Dr. Knoll pointed out in my conversation with him, by the way, if you haven't watched that video, you should definitely go watch that video. He was incredible to talk to. But as Dr. Knoll pointed out, even that descriptor really isn't that effective because that fourfold theological set of characteristics would definitely describe a African-American church where almost everyone would tend to vote Democratic. But it would also describe a conservative, God and country style, more fundamentalist leaning church where almost everybody would vote Republican. Well, because of that, the term evangelical then, in this new sense, doesn't really accomplish much theologically. It's more of a political denomination. So I do think the word is in trouble. I don't think the word is accomplishing what people might like it to accomplish anymore. As we talked about a moment ago, my friend, I'm sure that even that statement causes some of you to hackle up a little bit and be like, but okay, fine. Other words want to evolve. Cool. I get that. I don't care if literally means literally or figuratively means literally, whatever, fine. But not evangelical. That's me. That's my thing. That's my tribe. That's my history. That's my theological distinctiveness. If we don't have that word, what do we have? And I would humbly and graciously push back on that reaction and on that impulse. I don't think Dr. Knoll, and I know certainly not me, I don't think either of us are saying that it's time to move on from those theological convictions. What, are you kidding me? Those theological convictions are Bible. Like, the Bible holds out Jesus as doing something remarkable on the cross that defeats sin and death. The creeds hold that out. All of historical Christianity agrees on that. And that the Bible is authoritative and it's from God. That's Christianity. Nobody wants to move on from that who's a part of this circle. That there's some sort of thing where God does a work in people's lives and defeats death in them and gives them his life and his righteousness. No, we don't want to move on from that. I mean, these are, again, they're all crucial theological doctrines. What I am saying is that, that word you keep using, evangelical, I do not think it means what you think it means. I think it's changed. It's evolved. And what I found in a moment not too long ago when I went out into my community, and I started asking around, was that no one knows what it means. I wanted to go find out if this name that was literally on the sign of my church that I pastored, I wanted to find out if this word meant anything to anybody. It didn't. I talked to a dozen acquaintances and friends who are not Christians, didn't go to church. None of them had corresponding definitions. None of them in any way came close to defining it the way I would define it, or with those theological characteristics I just mentioned. It was mostly something vaguely about believing in the Bible, fundamentalism, politics, Trump, the Bush family, conservatism, things like that. Well, then I went and I talked to people in my church. I was like, hey, this is what I found out in the community. I wonder if this name might not be a great thing to have as our forward-facing brand to the people we're trying to reach and serve in the larger world. And understandably, people had the same reaction that maybe you might be feeling a little bit. And they were all awesome about it. I mean, that church is phenomenal, beginning to end. I loved my time there. And even though everybody handled, our interactions over it with tremendous maturity and thoughtfulness, still a bunch of people came to me and they're like, hey, like just kind of privately here, I really like the word evangelical. I think it describes who I am. And without trying to embarrass anybody, I just politely asked each person who brought that up what evangelical means. Even in a church with evangelical on the name, no two people agreed. Most people in church conflated evangelical with evangelistic. They're like, well, we still want to tell people about Jesus. Well, that's evangelism. That's evangelistic. Evangelical means something different than that. And they didn't know that. Well, okay. No hard feelings, no shame. I mean, we're talking about how this word has become super nebulous and ineffective. Like, of course, people aren't going to know what it means. Does anybody know what it means? Does anybody really own the definition of this thing anyway? And so, as a result, all the people I talked to in church eventually came to a place where they're like, I guess I'm not sure what the word means. And if I don't know what it means, why would I expect people outside to know what it means? Maybe this just isn't the most effective term anymore. So how'd we get there? Oh, I don't know. I mean, the quick version, I think, is probably a combination of political impulses and market forces. Politically, coming off of the counterculture and the disillusionment that people felt in the late 70s and early 80s coming out of the Vietnam War. I think there were a group of people who met that old description theologically of evangelical, who looked at the situation. They were like, hey, the world's taken a bit of a turn here, and we're not sure we're going to be able to keep up with the old grassroots plan of go reach people one at a time, talk to them about Jesus, have all of these conversions and this revival that causes a change from the ground up that alters society and government. And I just full disclosure here, I do disagree with this decision that those people made in that generation, but I think seeing the difficulty of the hard work of doing the grassroots ground up thing, they instead decided to take a shortcut. And I think the shortcut was to say, let's get our hands on the levers of power. We will change the way society works from the top down, and we'll make a world that's more conducive to people being moral and signing up to be Christians. I think that was a mistake. I think it was misguided, but that's another conversation for another time. I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Maybe good stuff came out of that. Maybe some problematic stuff came out of that as well. What definitely happened, though, was in order to get that much political momentum, you had to broaden the boundaries of theological specificity within whatever you would call evangelicalism. If you try to create a coalition for the sake of gaining political power or bringing about political reform, well, you don't want to nitpick about tiny little theological details. You're going to alienate 20% of people there. There goes 10% of people there. You're running off all of the tribes that you need to come together in this coalition. Fast forward 20 or 30 years, and theology, the thing that undergirded a lot of the social values that they wanted to achieve in the first place, those theological underpinnings gradually get forced into the background. Eventually, you've got a whole new generation of people leading it who were never really raised around that stuff. And so there's not really any theological connection to those political maneuverings. And then you run into some pretty ugly, pretty destructive stuff. And it has an enormous impact on the effectiveness of the word evangelical. It's why I think we see that third kind of shift where evangelical goes from meaning a theological thing to a political thing. Additionally, the marketplace, late 70s, early 80s, art, movies, music, books, etc., starts to take a pivot towards something more gritty, less family friendly. I think people got together, people who met that old definition of evangelical, and they looked at it and they're like, this is a problem. We need to make a Christian version of that same kind of art. Probably a bunch of good stuff came out of that. Again, I'm a little suspicious of this approach, but not prepared to, get out the broad brush and just hand wave all of it. But market forces are market forces. As I make this video, I'm taking a tremendous risk. This is all I do for a living. I mean, I'm not going to buy a yacht or get rich doing it, but this is what I do now. And every time we get together and I talk about this expression of faith or that expression of faith and every time I try to do it with specificity, I risk alienating a bunch of you because I didn't use the right words or understand it, or maybe I fumble fingered it, or maybe it just didn't sound like I liked your thing enough. I don't want to do that. I want us to like each other and hang out even if we don't see everything the same way. But you better believe it's in the back of my mind every time I turn on a camera to do this, that I might alienate a chunk of the people who make this thing go. So there's a risk to it. Well, now magnify that by multiple magnitudes of order and all kinds of dollars and corporations and artists and people making art. And what you get over a period of time is, I think, the Christian marketplace requires theological generalism. Like maybe stuff that's theologically true, but just safe. There's going to be this market financial pushback, this pressure that everybody in that field feels to not be specific. Like, let's just do kind of Disneyfied Christianity, like not heresy, but super basic stuff that anybody of any general theological stripe could agree with. Like, God is real. God is good. People are good, which is not really what the Bible says at all. Things are hard, and God cares about the hard times in your life and wants to help you feel better about those things. Prayer is somehow good. The Bible it's important. To read it, or it's important. And love is good. And all of those things, except the one about like human depravity, all of those things, sure, but it's really incomplete. And so political forces, I think, have softened the meaning of the word evangelical. Market forces in the Christian subculture have softened the theological distinctiveness of the word evangelical. And now I think evangelical has come to mean that nebulous, theologically unconvicted, squishy, largely therapeutic middle that does not promote the life of the mind or deep thought, but has its underpinnings way back in the day, like Numble's pie, in something that made sense and that was a little more clearly defined. Could be wrong on all of that. But for the moment, just for the sake of the thought exercise, we're going to pretend that I'm sort of onto something and that my observations are in the ballpark of accurate. And I want to wrap up here by talking about what we might do next. And by we, I mean people who like words but aren't Christians and are on the outside looking into all of this conversation and just like for things to be more clearly named. By we, I also mean people who are in the Christian side of the conversation, maybe even the evangelical side of the conversation, and are scratching their head trying to think about how to make this thing make more sense and make whatever term we use to describe this chunk of Christianity actually mean something again. So here's my proposals, or I should say, here are things I think are our options. Option number one, thing we could do in response to evangelicalism losing its effectiveness as a word. One, we could do nothing. Proceed exactly as it's been, assume that the problem is misunderstandings outside of Christianity, and that eventually those people who misunderstand it, they'll move on to being worried about something else. We don't change anything, we don't adjust anything, we don't think about what we call ourselves, we just continue on the way, and hopefully it'll all work itself out. I'm not crazy about that plan. There are smart, good people who are embracing that plan. Maybe they're onto something I'm not. A second option would be to fight for the word, like the linguistic purist I mentioned earlier. Salvaging the word would mean saying evangelical is the term we're locked onto, we're fixated on that, but we have to go to war on social media to make people more sensitive to what this term actually means. We have to demand that people respect our terms. We need to take a page out of the playbook of other groups over the last 15 years and get a little bit offended and get a little bit demanding and get a little bit testy and demand our rights and demand that our language be respected. I don't think those are particularly kingdom-ish values, and in going on such a linguistic war path, I think we could undermine the actual things that we claim to believe and are trying to reclaim, but some people who are smart and good really want to try to salvage the word. And I have to admit, that is an option. A third option would be to just rebrand. Leave everything exactly as it is. Don't change how we do stuff theologically, politically, socially, but just pick a better name. Something that doesn't have any baggage yet. Start fresh with that. Something that really pops and sounds cool. You could put together a committee, have like a 2-year research plan, and then they come out, their conclave, and they're like, here's the new word. This is what we are now. And then we all just use it relentlessly. We hashtag it up and we make it happen. I don't think this is the most effective plan. And I do think we have tried the rebranding thing several times in the last 20 years without great effect. Eventually, a thing will always take on the connotations of what the thing actually is and how the thing is actually perceived. No matter what word you put on it, it just delays it and resets that process of denominating again and again and again. So I don't know. It just doesn't seem like it's that effective. It seems like it's, deck chairs on the Titanic. The fourth option that I see would be to abandon the whole project of trying to come up with a name for such a diverse expression of Christianity and say, the whole strategy for this word was just maybe right at the time, but it's not right anymore. So what we're going to do instead is just go to specificity. If you're a Reformed Baptist, you are a Reformed Baptist. If you are Presbyterian, you are a Presbyterian. Or maybe you'd need to be specific about what brand of Presbyterian. If you are a non-denominational megachurch, I guess you would just say that, non-denominational. If you're Pentecostal, you would just say Pentecostal. And the more specificity that we could use with these terms, the more quickly I think evangelicalism as a clumsy, ineffective term would start to wash downstream. And then who knows, maybe in a few years it would make sense to resuscitate that. The last option in terms of how we could proceed in finding a way to move forward with this clumsy term, this clumsy organizational clumping that we have with evangelicalism, would be to take a cue from the LGBTQ community. Now, I know that even bringing that up is going to make some people real excited to see what I say next, some people really upset right off the bat, and one way or the other, you might be feeling a lot of things. Here's the deal. That's a smart crowd that found themselves in a very difficult situation, much like evangelicals find themselves in now. Back in the 80s, you have these different expressions of historically non-traditional sexuality that these different groups, they looked at each other and like, well, I'm not you and you're not me. And what I do is definitely not what you do. And how you live is not how I live. But we have shared interests. We have some common cause here, but we're not willing to sacrifice the uniqueness of our own different expressions for the benefit of some larger, more meaningless name. And so they went with an initialism. And at first it had only a few letters, and then over time it's added more letters. And I've heard people from within that community and outside that community kind of poke fun and jab at that and have a little bit of a laugh at that expense. But it's one strategy, and that would be to just come up with a bunch of letters that mean a whole bunch of things that generally have common cause under the banner of Christian assumptions. Another option, and maybe I'm adding one here, but a final option perhaps would be to go with something more generic altogether and just give up entirely on trying to name or lump this this type of historical Christianity, this part of the Christian family tree. And I hear people trying to do this a lot. They'll say things like, well, I don't like this whole video. I don't like this whole conversation. I don't like it when we talk about denominations because I am just a Christian. I think that's great. Me too. But at the same time, to my friend who's been saying that through this whole video and feeling agitated, is there any boundary marker for that? I'm literally asking you, is there anything that somebody could say where they are like, hey, I'm a Christian and I also believe this about God? Is there anything they could say that would cause you to say, oh, okay, well, I like you and I think it's cool that you call yourself a Christian, but if that's how you think God is, that's not Christianity. That's a different thing. Historically, that needs a different definition. Is there any boundary marker for you in terms of what is or what isn't Christian? Now, I would have to think that there is. And so I understand the impulse to retreat to more general terms because this stuff is overwhelming and it's kind of frustrating and it requires a lot of work and a lot of thought. And sometimes it even makes the whole proposition of being a Christian and following Christ feel somehow polluted or diluted. Like I'm worried about all this stuff that I don't even want to be worried about. I just want to follow Jesus. I just want to try to do what's right. I just want to lean into the gracious work of the Holy Spirit in my life, which is awesome. But the term Christian alone doesn't seem to generate enough specificity to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here. Either people say, I'm a Christ follower, or I'm a gospel person, or I am a Bible believer. But my same pushback question applies to all of that. Is there anything that another person who says I'm a Christ follower or I'm a Bible believer and I believe the following things about God, is there anything they could say that would cause you to say, well, like you seem cool, I like you, and we're friends and all, but if you think that, you're not really a Bible believer because the Bible says the opposite of that about God. Or if you think that, you're not really a Christ follower because that's a completely different Christ than we see held out in the Bible. I'm sure that for all of you, for all of us, there is some boundary marker. Well, that means that we all assent to the idea of there being linguistic boundary markers simply for the purposes of just keeping our thoughts straight. It's not ultimately to decide who's good and who's bad and who gets to go to hell and who gets to go to heaven. That's not the exercise here. I'm just talking taxonomy in this conversation. Words that are accurate and precise and mean a thing are important to us understanding each other, and they're important to us liking each other and getting along. The more sloppy we become with that language, the harder it is for us to understand each other and get along and to move the conversation forward. Now, what's interesting is that the tail end of the modern era tended to bloat out words and expand meanings and definitions. This mistake we've held over here, like with the word thing. Whereas the postmodern era of thought has tended to dive into more specificity on lots of things we've never really been specific about in the past. Tiny little pieces of nuance between this community and that community and how these people think about this thing or how those people do that thing. That's expected. We're very, very specific in our language in so many ways. But it feels like this aspect of Christianity is still lingering in a bygone age with a different mentality about how we order our language and how we organize our thoughts. Maybe that's some kind of vestigial remnant or component of us not wanting to sound like jerks, not wanting to be too decisive in our language and exclude people. Maybe it's just that, there's a delay sometimes as thought and communication evolves, and maybe evangelicalism is kind of lagging behind as a term in the evolution of language and thought. My argument's pretty simple. I think the theology behind what has been known as evangelical is hyper biblical. I think it makes a ton of sense. And I think there are a whole bunch of Christians who would never call themselves evangelical who would have to say, well, if those are the four qualifications, yeah, I'm probably in on that too. But I'm not an evangelical. So I'm not promoting the idea that we should just abandon all of our theological convictions and move on from that stuff. Man, that's dumb. I'm suggesting the exact opposite. I think we should lean harder into our theological convictions, use more specific language to describe them, and just relax around people who don't share those same exact convictions. Theoretically, if we develop this language the right way, we should be able to figure out where we're all coming from in just a few terms. And it's like, great, let's have a drink together and think about things. And at the end, if we understand each other better, or maybe even you make some good points and you give me something to think about and I come around a little bit, or if at the end we really did a bang up job of taking apart and dissecting each other's views and wipe the blood off our lip and high five, that's just a win. That's great. That's how collegiality and growth and better understanding, not just of others, but of our own ideas works. I think the term evangelical is doing us a disservice at this point. I'm not just going to quit using it tomorrow, but I am definitely in the process of thinking about what might come next and what would be a better way to articulate what people like us believe, not just to ourselves and to each other, but also to people who aren't a part of this in any way. Hopefully you're tracking with where I'm coming from with this conversation. If any bit of this sounded like, I think you're dumb or wrong about everything, or I think this group's wrong, or picking a fight with that group over there, well, I would ask for your grace on that. That's not what I want to communicate at all. Rather, what I hope this comes off as is self-reflection and taxonomy and an attempt to do a better job of saying what I mean with fewer words. Fewer words. How many minutes in are we here? We've been talking for a long time. I'm going to let you be. Thanks for gaming this out. I've really enjoyed these 3 conversations we've had about what evangelicalism is, where it's been, what it means, and maybe even where it's going next. I appreciate you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's do this again soon.